Thanks everyone for coming out today. I really appreciate it. It's great to see everyone here. Thanks Melanie for inviting me. Thanks Joseph and JD for the audiovisual help. Appreciate it. So as Melanie said, the inspiration for this talk comes from my own children. So my daughter Dylan is a junior in high school, and my son Eli is a freshman in high school, and they are both distance runners. They participate in the track and cross-country programs at Grandville High School locally here. And so the inspiration for this idea comes from their experiences in distance running. And as Melanie said, my normal area is artificial intelligence. So this is kind of a new area for me to dabble in this. So let's go ahead and jump right in. This talk, this research area, is at this neat intersection in three different areas that I love. Certainly in mathematics, and I count mathematics and computer science here because there's the mathematics, the analytical work of studying a problem, and then the algorithmic work of figuring out a solution to that problem. So certainly that's my home discipline. In college, I got sparked in philosophy when I was forced to take a general education requirement, and I loved it and ended up doing a minor in philosophy. So I've always been kind of interested in notions of fairness and ethics and so forth. And then taking those two ideas of philosophy and mathematics and applying them to some really interesting problems in society. So there's a branch of mathematics called mathematical equity. Goes by some other titles or names. But there's a lot of really interesting work being done at the intersection of these three spheres. And this kind of falls in that realm. So we'll see where that comes to play. So in the philosophy side of things, we turn to philosophers to ask ourselves, what's the right thing to do, right? Given a particular situation, what should we be doing? And how do we understand what those are? What are different options and different choices and so forth? So that's kind of the philosophical question. That's an important one because it gives us a grounding as a mathematician. And then in mathematics and computer science, we say, well, what's the best way to do it, right? If we know what we should be doing, how do we achieve that result, right? How do you put that idea in practice? And then can you assess it? Can you make sure that you're doing the thing that you should be doing and accomplishing the goal you should be accomplishing? So philosophy gives us a target, and mathematics gives us the vehicle for reaching that target. And then, so we're not just living in this abstract world, we look at real problems in society and try to solve those problems. And certainly I'm not the first one to do this. There's lots of people who do this kind of work, and it's been going on for a long time. So I just wanted to plant a seed of a couple of examples of this kind of work in action and where it matters to us as real people. One of the sort of historical examples of this work is the apportionment problem. How do we decide how many representatives in the House of Representatives each state gets and so forth? So this is a problem that falls in the intersection of mathematics, society, and philosophy. It's been a really neat problem. It developed a lot of interesting mathematics in the 1700s and 1800s as democracies were blossoming in Europe and the United States. All kinds of new interesting problems arose and how to solve them. So a lot of really good work's been done on this particular problem. And there's volumes of books and research papers on this apportionment problem. So like, for example, Ohio has 16 representatives in this map, whereas Kentucky has 6. And that's based on the proportion of population. But it doesn't always work out that cleanly. Ohio might really deserve like 15.81, right? And Kentucky might deserve 6.23. What do you do with those decimals, right? How do you decide if Ohio should get 15 or 16, and how do you decide if Kentucky should get 6 or 7? How do you do the rounding part? And so there's all kinds of really interesting work being done, or has been done in the past mostly, about this problem. And there's political debates about it, and it's a fascinating problem to study from politics, from history, from mathematics. So it's really, really interesting. Another example of this kind of work is fair division. So the famous cake cutting algorithm. And believe it or not, yes, there are entire textbooks written on how you cut cake. And I don't mean, from a design aesthetic point of view. I mean from a fairness point of view, right? How do you take something that people have claim to, property, and how do you divide that fairly in regards to or taking into account the different claims that people have on that property? So again, there's textbooks written on this. I actually taught a Denison seminar for a couple of years on these kinds of algorithms, and it's a really fun area to play with in recreational mathematics. Another example, and this is a nod to Valentine's Day, which is coming up. So computer scientists actually study something called the stable marriage algorithm, and it is a matching algorithm. How do we take a set of preferences of people, in this case it's potential mates, like I prefer person A to person B to person C and so forth, so you give rankings, and then you try to form a matching between all the groups to try to make it stable, and there's a formulaic way for measuring stability and so forth. So you want to avoid the unstable situation where you've coupled people up, but there's two particular people who'd rather be with each other than their partners, and that's an unstable situation. And so there's algorithms for this. They measure it efficiently. They measure happiness. Trust me, this is all really interesting. So this is another example of that kind of interplay. And I could give this talk too, but and people say mathematicians and computer scientists aren't romantic. So our problem, this is our example. So the problem that I want to talk about today has to do with high school sports. And so I want to look at, in particular, the problem of cross-country sports in high school. So like I said, my kids are participating in the high school cross-country program, as do Kathy Dollar's children and so forth. This is a picture of my daughter's feet. This is the women's side, or the female side of the cross-country program. So I confess I'm an obnoxious parent, and I will sprinkle my presentation with slides of my children. So sorry about that. All right, so let's go ahead and dig into this problem and see where it takes us and so forth. So I want to give you a problem to think about first. So if I were to take the audience here and put us on a tour bus and drive us around Ohio and visit different communities and different school districts with the goal of, without you knowing, if you're not an expert in cross-country, we would visit a community and then I would ask for your opinion. Do you think this particular community has a good cross-country program, yes or no? So I want you to think for a moment, what kinds of things would you look for or want to measure about a community to guess if they maybe do have a good cross-country program or maybe they don't have a successful cross-country program? So let me give you a second to think about that. All right, so audience participation time. Somebody throw some idea out. What would you look for in terms of guessing whether or not a community in Ohio has a good cross-country program or not? Win-loss ratio. So you can actually go back and measure historical records, right? So let's suppose I kept those from your view, right? So you just look at the community itself. What other kinds of things might you observe? Yeah.
How many people, how many children participate?
Yeah, participation levels, right? So certainly that, right? How much engagement with the school athletic programs do they have in that community? Yeah, absolutely, right? So socioeconomic status, there's a lot of really interesting work done. Distance runners tend to come from white affluent backgrounds, right? I mean, that's the reality of where it is, so yeah. Yeah, the community in which they're located, right? And is there a safe place to run? That's actually a big factor in determining sort of the success of cross-country programs. Yeah. Yeah. Does the program have good rapport, right? Is there good coaching? Is there a legacy of tradition in the community for supporting the program? Does the community support the program? So yeah, some of those things. Yeah. Yeah, right. So what's the activity level of the community? You guys are hitting all these things. So, excellence in XC programs. So this is work that I want to do that I kind of already have a pretty good idea about, and I want to actually go and measure using demographic data. But certainly there's a strong correlation between socioeconomic status and distance running in programs. Distance running, good high school cross-country distance programs tend to come from the suburbs. They tend not to come from the inner city. There tends not to be good places to run in the inner city. And they tend not to come very, very rural communities where there's not enough of a population concentration and to sustain those kind of programs. So they tend to be small towns like Grandville or suburban kind of communities like New Albany kind of things. The lifestyle of the community ends up having a high correlation with cross-country programs. Football is the giant in Ohio. Basketball gets a lot of attention and so forth. If you're going to be a cross-country runner in high school, more than likely you have parents who also are active or were active at one point in time. And so, the kinds of communities that attract active people tend to have active parents who tend to produce or, make active children and so forth. So that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy is a big play in cross-country programs in particular. Tradition in coaching, the support of the community, and school size, right? So that's a big factor. How big is your school? How many students do you have in your school to populate a cross-country program? So that turns out to be a big factor. And that's the one that we're going to look at in this particular talk. I want to know, or I want to understand better the dynamics between school size and how successful a cross-country program can be. So that's where we're going with this. Okay, so there's an organization, if you have children in the high school who are active in high school sports in Ohio, you would know about OSHA, the Ohio High School Athletic Association. It's the governing body that oversees all of Ohio's high school sports competitions. They have a website, they have a directory, they have meetings, they have committees, they have all kinds of wonderful things. There's lots of information that they provide. And unfortunately, some of the information they don't provide is really hard to get. They're just not in the information sharing business quite yet. But one of the things that they do have sort of a list of standards or a list of values that they try to achieve. And so one of the particular things that they say their organization is trying to achieve is establishing and regulating regular season and tournament standards in order for competition to be fair and equitable. So we want, with this notion of equity and this notion of fairness, and we want to try to get an idea of how well is that ideal being achieved in high school in Ohio for sports competitions, particularly for cross country. So then the big question is, what does fairness mean in terms of size? So this is my second question back to the audience. I want you to think for a second. If you have school, let's call school A, which has maybe 400 students in population, and school B, which maybe has 1,600 students in population, it's 4 times bigger, right? What would be a notion of fairness for school A and B competing in a cross-country meet? What kinds of things would you want to see as possible measures of fairness for that? Okay, so you would imagine that the bigger school might have it has 4 times as many students. They might have a larger number of students competing on the team, so they might have a larger team. Right? I'm sorry? Extreme score? Oh, okay. Yeah. So they're more likely to have really, really good outlier runners, right? So that's the kind of thing. So that kind of idea is going to be really important, is measuring how likely a particular school is to have an outlier runner in its population, right? So that idea. So this is the philosophy part of the talk. So this is where I turn to my friend Aristotle, right? It would be naive to think that school A and B could compete equally, right? Because they're just different, right? They're different sizes. So an improper measure of fairness might be to say, well, we should be able to look at the historical record of team A and B competing against each other and see if team A and B are winning against each other in the same amount, right? The same number of wins for A, the same number of wins for B. That's probably not realistic, right? And that's maybe not what is meant by fair. Fair is not necessarily equitable, right? Or equal. And Aristotle gives us a different idea, this idea of proportional fairness. So this proportionality rule that comes from Aristotle says that team B is 4 times as big as team A, and therefore should be winning about 4 times more often than team A. So team A should have some legitimate chances to win, but maybe only winning about 20% of the competitions, a ratio of 4 to 1 for team B to team A. So this is the notion of fairness that we use in our research work to try to establish this is the metric by which we use. So we're going to go into Ohio schools and we're going to start looking at their populations and we're going to start measuring competitions between teams and we're going to be looking for this kind of proportionality to see if it's achieved or not, and so forth. Okay, so here's shameless pictures of my kids. This is my son Eli. He won that sprint. He beat 3 other kids in a sprint finish. This is 8th grade. Anyways, so high school divisions in sports. So OSHA is aware of the problem of having really, really big schools compete against really small schools, right? And there's just it's not going to be fair. It's not fun for the big school. It's not fun for certainly not fun for the small school. And so one of the tactics or strategies that OSHA uses is it divides school districts into divisions, right? And the number of divisions in a sport depends on the particular sport. So in high school football in Ohio, there are 7 divisions. And so the teams, the teams across the state are divided into 7 different divisions, largely based on their population, but also with some regard to geography and so forth. In the cross-country racing, there are 3 divisions. And so there's Division 1, which comprises the largest schools. There's Division 2, which are the medium schools, and there's Division 3, which is the smallest schools. So this is OSHA's attempt to try to make the playing field more equitable so that really, really giant schools aren't competing against really small schools, and so forth. So let's see how this idea works out. So we went and grabbed from the Ohio State Education, from the State of Ohio Board of Education, school district population. So you can actually go and get this data. It's available publicly. And you can get the population of every school in the state of Ohio. And they range from the smallest thing, that's the Chaffin Career Center, which has 16 students. This is a year and a half old now, so this is back in 2018. The Chaffin Career Center was the smallest recognized school in the state of Ohio with 16 students. And all the way up to Mason, which I think is in Cincinnati, which has 1,728 students. That's their school population numbers. So we went and got all this data, and that gives us a baseline for figuring out how big these schools are. Right? Now we have to take these programs and we have to divide them into 3 divisions. So this is the distribution of all those school populations. Right? So at one end, when I say distribution, that's Mason right there with their 1,728 students. Right? Here are a bunch of schools that are really tiny. There are about 100 schools or less, and so forth. I actually cut the data off at less than 100 because no team with fewer than 100 students actually fielded a cross-country team, and so that's what I had for that. And actually, this is measuring a school female population because males and females compete separately. They're scored separately, and because my daughter was older and my daughter was experiencing this, I just chose to follow the female teams. So Mason actually has about 3,400 students in its population, but only 1,734 for the women's side. But one of the problems becomes evident. It's not a uniform distribution. A uniform distribution is flat, right? The same number of large schools, the same number of small schools. This is more like an exponential distribution. It's not technically an exponential distribution, but it's more like that. So now this idea of dividing the schools into 3 divisions becomes a little more problematic. So here's what this looks like. This is by total school population. So for the sport of cross country, if we take the top third of the schools and the middle third and the lowest third, right, this is what we get for our 3 divisions. So in Division 1, we have the range from 3,500 to about 850 students. In Division 2, we go from about 850 to about 450 students. And in Division 3, we go from 450 down to about 100 students or less than 100. So this is what, if we were to take these 3 divisions, this is what it actually looks like. And you see that Division 1 has a larger range. Between the smallest and the largest team, there's a much bigger range in there. Whereas in Division 2 and Division 3, they're much more bunched together. So the range between the smallest and largest is much smaller. So one of my own personal motivation for this was that a year and a half ago or 2 years ago in the cross-country program, Grandville, the Grandville girls team, was the very smallest Division 1 school. By 1 student. If we actually had 1 fewer female students, we would have been in Division 2. And we're competing against teams like Mason, which are roughly 4 times larger than us within Division 1. And so our coach at the time was upset about this and said, gee, this isn't fair. We shouldn't be in Division 1. We should be in Division 2. The ratio, we're competing against schools that are so much bigger than us. We lose the incentive to compete, right? There's not a fair process here. And that was a legitimate claim. And so I thought, gee, is there some way to quantify this? Is there some way to measure whether or not this is actually playing out in reality or not? And this is the work I've been doing for the last year and a half and so forth. So trying to figure this out. We did think as the parents group, Kathy can attest to this, if maybe we could just find 1 girl in the school and just kind of take her out of the school district. And it's like, we just decided against that. That wasn't the right thing to do. So. So this is the question. A big school like Mason, basically 4 times as big as Grandville, what's the competitive advantage, right? Can we compete against Mason in the ratio of about 1/4, right? Can we win about 20% of the competitions against Mason, a school like Mason? So forth. So here's the approach that we used. This is ongoing work. So the approach that I'm going to talk about is work that we've already done, and I might hint at some work that we're going to do that's ongoing now, and I'm going to hopefully have a couple of summer research students to work with me on. What we did is we did two things. We built a model of high school age female running, and then we used the statistical model to build Monte Carlo simulations. And Monte Carlo simulations are like computer simulations that simulate competitions between teams. So I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. So two things, we built a model and we did simulations. So let's see what each of those parts look like in our work. So to build our model, we then went back online, we found data. I found 10,000 recorded 5K runs from high school age females, so females ages 14 to 18. And so we get a distribution of their running ability, of what it looks like. And then we also went to Strava. Later, we got some permissions from Strava to tap some data. So we found 90 million recorded runs on Strava from females, and then we filtered that down to the appropriate age group. So we used this big data set to try to figure out what's the distribution of high school age females running 5Ks? What kind of paces do they maintain? And this is what we get. So the blue is the data, the distribution that we got. And on the bottom here, we have the per mile pace for a 5K effort. So at the very fastest end down here, runners are under 6 minutes per mile for a 5K pace. And at the very bigger end down here, they're over 20 minutes per mile. They're kind of walking pace and so forth. So this is the distribution. So on average, it's about 12 minutes per mile for general population females. Now, we're making a little bit of an assumption by that because the recorded times are obviously not from general population. They're from people who are actually running. And so this might be a skewed distribution, a little bit fast than probably what the actual population is. But for our purposes, it's not going to matter a whole lot. So then what we did is we fitted a beta probability model to this, and that's the orange line. So we do a beta probability fit to this, and it fit the data actually really, really well. And the beta model is our model that we're going to use to field samples for our Monte Carlo simulation. These are recorded times from female age populations. I don't know if they're high school cross-country races or they're road races or they're just somebody went out for a training run with a GPS watch. So it could be anything. Yep. And that makes a difference too. So what do I do with this Monte Carlo simulations? We're going to simulate 1,000 seasons, 1,000 years of competition. And so we need a lot of data. So we're going to simulate 1,000 years of competition between these schools. And for each season, we're going to draw the entire school's population. So we're going to take the entire school's, like 433 students from Grandville, and we're going to simulate the drawing of that population. And then from that, we're going to select the fastest 7 runners in the school, and they're going to be the high school cross-country team for that school. And we're going to measure some statistics about that. So here's what it looks like pictorially. We have our model. For Grandville on the bottom, I'm going to sample this model 433 times. So I'm going to take random samples from this model 433 times. That's Grandville school population. I line them all up from fastest to smallest, and I take the 7 fastest runners, and that's the high school cross-country team. Right? And I do that 1,000 times. So one season is 7 runners, and then I start all over again. I throw out all the data, and I start over with 433 new runners, and that's season 2, and so forth. And I do the same thing for Mason, except I'm sampling 1,728 times. And as you would imagine, as Nestor pointed out, you're more likely to get those really fast runners down here at the tail of the distribution if you sample more times, right? And so we want to know what's the effect of sampling 4 times more often in terms of getting the top 7. All right, so what if we just look at the fastest runner on each team? So for one season, I'm going to look at the fastest runner, and I'm going to do that 1,000 times. And the data for Grandville, team 2, is the orange-red. So that's the distribution you get. It varies between something like 5:30 pace, which is a little unrealistic, to more like 6:30 pace. But if from the 433 students, that's what you would expect to get for a team of Grandville. Now, Mason, in the blue, is a sharper distribution, and it's more concentrated, and it's a little bit more to the left. It's a little faster. So on average, Mason's fastest runner is about 12 to 15 seconds per mile faster than Grandville's fastest runner. But interestingly, in 20% of the seasons, Grandville actually fields a faster runner. There's overlap in the populations. So, and actually, the fastest runner from Grandville is in proportion to the school sizes. So about 20% of the time, Grandville has a faster runner than Mason, which is exactly what you want to see. But that's not how you score cross-country competitions. You don't just measure the fastest runner. You measure the time of the fastest 5, and then there's some displacement with the last 2 runners. But it's basically the sum of the finishing places from the top 5. And because we're measuring the second fastest and third fastest and fourth fastest, the effects of sampling distribution become much more pronounced. And let's see that in this next chart here. So now we have team 1 up here. This is Mason. That's their average pace for their fastest runner, 5:36. That's the average pace for their second fastest runner, and third and fourth and fifth and sixth and seventh and so forth. You can see the concentration of the average paces. And the error bars there are 1 standard deviation. So it gives you an idea of the spread of the fastest runner, the spread of the second fastest runner. Down here, here's Grandville. And sometimes Grandville, like I said, 20% of the time has a faster runner than the first fastest runner over there. But look at the distribution of the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh runners. They're much slower and they're much more spread out, right? And so here are the advantage, the sampling advantage that we saw in the first distribution being kind of fair for the fastest runner does not play out for the second, third, fourth, and so forth. In fact, on average, Grandville's second fastest runner is slower than Mason's seventh fastest runner, just by a little bit. You can see that there. So already we get an idea that the team scores are maybe not going to play out in the way we thought. So we do this, now I'm going to do this now for 10,000 seasons. So 10,000 years of data, I'm going to do this simulation, and I'm going to actually simulate a cross-country competition. I'm going to have Grandville and Mason compete against all the 500 schools in the state of Ohio, and then they go through this process of the 20 fastest go from their league to their districts, and then from districts to regionals, and then from regionals to states. And I want to know how often does each team get to states, and how often does the team win state competition? Right? For 10,000 years, how often does a school win the state competition? And this is what we get over here. So this is school enrollment, female school enrollment. There's Mason with their 1,728. Here's Grandville with 433 students. And this is the number of championships they win in 10,000 simulated seasons. So we see up here, Mason wins 850 team championships out of 10,000. They win 8.5% of the time, which is a lot, out of the 168 schools in Division I. This is for Division I only. Grandville wins 2. So they win 2 out of 10,000 state championships. So they did win, but they only won 2. Right? And you can see in particular here that these schools down here that are small almost never win. And most of the wins are clustered in teams like Mason and Beaver Creek, and and there's a couple of schools that always win state titles, and they are all right here. The teams that win state titles are right up here, in simulation and in reality. So to put this in perspective, I'm going to go back to this. The one thing that I notice here is this is not a straight line, right? The correlation between winning and size is not linear, right? And it would be linear if we were following Aristotle's proportionality. We would expect this to be a linear relationship. It's not linear. So how does that play out? According to their population, the percentage of students that attend Mason out of all Division I schools, they should be winning 147 of the state titles out of the 10,000. They actually win 850. So that's what they should win based on proportional size. That's what they actually win, 850. Right? Grandville should win 37. They actually win 2. So we created a metric to try to make this easier to understand. It's called the normalized win rate. And in the normalized win rate, we measure the expected number of wins based on population divided by, the actual number of wins divided by the expected number of wins. So if the actual number of wins is equal to the expected number of wins, the ratio would be 1.0. You should win about as often as you do. If you are winning more often, your ratio is going to be higher than 1. Like 2.0 means you're winning twice as often as you should based on the school size. If you're below 1, like at a half, you're winning half as often, right? So the ratio measures how close you are to the ideal of winning in proportion to your school size. So we take this normalized win rate and I color code it with kind of an ethical scale here. This is the ideal. Every school should be at 1.0. You should be winning in the same rate as your proportion of your school size. Right? So if every team had a normalized win rate of 1.0, we'd be perfect. If you are above 1.0, you're winning more often. And I arbitrarily set the cutoff at 1.5. So if you're winning 1.5 times as much, that's the boundary between acceptable and maybe unacceptable or marginal. If you're winning more than twice as often as you should, you're unacceptably winning too often. And then conversely, the same scale going in logarithmic distances below, 2/3 there for the acceptable, the marginal rate. And then if you're winning less than half as often as you should, that's unacceptable. So we can take each school and we can compute their normalized win rate, and then we can color code it as a dot that's either red, which is bad, or yellow, which is and green, which is good. And see how many schools in this Division I are color coded the right way. And this is what we get. So this is Division 1 here, that's Division 2, and that's Division 3. So the 3 divisions by size. So this is school size down here, female population. We can see these are the schools right here clustered around the 1.0 line that are doing well, right? These schools up here are winning way too often, and these schools down here are losing way too often. And in the normalized, or the log scale that I have on the y-axis, you can see that a lot of schools down here are losing way more than they should, and a few schools are winning much more often than they should. So Mason's normalized win rate is about 6.0. They're winning 6 times as often as they should on the basis of their population. And Grandville's is about 17 times smaller than it should. So they're 1/17 of the normalized win rate. So this kind of gives you an idea of how equitable the competition is between the schools in various divisions. Now it's worse in Division 1 because the spread between big and small is worse. And it's still pretty bad in Divisions 2 and 3. So this is one of the big sort of takeaway messages is this chart shows you that we're not achieving the kind of equity we hoped. Our coach really did have a beef to grind. It's like we just, no matter how good we're going to get, we just can't compete with the big schools. So in the last few minutes, we did then a second research effort looking at some alternative methods. What are other ways we could structure the environment, give OSHA some other choices to think about for maybe building in some more equity. So one of the things is the methods of creating divisions. So instead of setting the boundary divisions the way they are, can we set the boundary divisions somehow differently? I'll show you some choices in a second. Another idea is we could increase the number of divisions. If you increase the number of divisions, then the difference between big and small gets smaller, right? So, but it costs more money because you need more officials, you need more meets and things like that. This is an interesting idea that we came up with, imposing a cap. I'll talk about what that means so, in a second. So different division methods. So here's a couple different division methods we considered. This is the current division method right here that creates equal number of students in each division. So 168 schools in each division are right here. So 1/3 of the schools here, 1/3 of the schools in Division 2, 1/3 of the schools in Division 3. And the color gives you an idea of the range between biggest and smallest schools, right? You can see how pronounced it is in Division 1, how small it is in Division 3. What if we went with this method, which has the equal absolute difference? The size between the biggest and the smallest school in a division is the same, right? And we kept that the same. So we basically take the entire range and we divide it into 3 chunks. But the problem is only 7 schools fall in Division 1. That's how spread out it is, right? And 73 schools fall in Division 2. Almost all the schools fall in Division 3. That's just the way the ranges work out. This is equal relative difference. So what if we kept the ratio between the biggest and smallest schools the same in each division? Right now, it's 4-to-1 in Division 1, and it's 2-to-1 in each of the other 2 divisions. What if we made it so that the ratio was about 2.3 in each of the divisions? So that puts 75 schools in Division 1, 206 in Division 2, and 221 in Division 3. So different ways of thinking about dividing divisions. Another idea, this cap rule. So the real problem is there's about 12 to 20 schools that are just way bigger than everybody else. And if we could solve those 12 to 20 schools, that would help a lot. We could just take those 12 schools and just make it their own division. We could do that. But another way to think about this is you take those 12 schools and you just tell them, look, if you have more than 1,000 female runners, you're going to have to make 2 teams. So you flip a coin and Susie goes to team A and Jill goes to team B, and you divide up the teams that way, and you keep them that way for the 4 years. Right? Now they could have the same coaches, they could have the same staff, they could go to the same meets. They put on different jerseys, they compete differently. Right? So this is the cap rule, and it would only apply to 12 schools. Probably not going to be very popular for those 12 schools. So that gives us 12 different experimental combinations. I'll wrap this up here. We have 3 or 4 divisions, we have a cap, yes or no, and then we have these 3 division methods. And what we find is, some of the takeaways from this, is I measure here in the green bars the number of schools that have that acceptable normalized win rate. And we find some conclusions that, number one, that 4 divisions does help. 4 divisions over 3. It costs more money, but it certainly does help. The cap rule actually helps Division 1 a lot. It doesn't help the other 2 divisions because the other 2 divisions don't get affected by the cap rule. But the equity in Division 1 is increased significantly with the cap rule. It makes it a much more equal playing field. So for example, if you took Mason and you divided it into 2 teams, before they would win 850 competitions, and then each of the 2 sub-teams would win about 150 each. So you get 300 total instead of the 850 total. So the cap rule really helps limit the wins from those really big schools. The 3 different division methods, they don't really matter a whole lot. There's a little bit of flux there, but the 3 methods of division, you might as well just keep the equal numbers because it's easier to implement and so forth. So these are the sort of conclusions I have, and I do want to have some time for questions.